Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 3rd, 2022. It's Friday, so I'm going to take some questions, but I'm going to begin with just a quick update from the war front involving the Russian special military operations in Ukraine. There's been further destabilizations coming from the West. These just continue moving toward the point where the Russians will eventually feel compelled to respond. And this is where you see the danger, as the French media is now talking about, of sleepwalking into World War III. You have the deployment of offensive missiles, which can shoot rockets into Russian territory. Zelensky said he won't do it. Who can trust Zelensky? There was a report then yesterday of something quite ominous from General Nakasone, who's the commander of the U.S. Cyber Command. He admitted that the U.S. is conducting what he called, quote, a series of operations across the full spectrum, offensive, defensive, and information ops, unquote. Cyber warfare. Well, remember the fuss in the United States when the Russians were accused of intervening in the U.S. 2016 election with cyber operations? But here we are in the midst of a military confrontation, which is really NATO versus Russia. And now the U.S. is admitting to deploying cyber operations against Russian stations. This is, again, very destabilizing and threatening. But then there's a report in the French media of numerous cases of confirmation and documentation of Ukrainian war crimes committed against Russian soldiers. We hear this all the time about Russian soldiers with no evidence presented, but the French apparently have documentary evidence of Ukrainian war crimes. Well, these have been going on since 2014 in the Donbass, but for some reason, that's not part of the narrative that comes out from the Western media. Now, speaking of which, there was a story which you probably didn't get in your local paper about the Ukrainian Parliamentary Commission for Human Rights chairman, Lyudmila Denisova, who was fired for spreading stories of Russian atrocities. These were stories that include this crazy story of Russian soldiers raping and killing a 1-year-old baby. This was spread throughout the media. And then it turned out this woman was making it up, or someone was making it up. The commission that fired her said that these are stories from unverified sources. Well, that's typical of how the narrative is shaped, unverified sources. So let's go to the questions that I think will include some stories about unverified, anonymous sources who are being used to carry out information or hybrid warfare. Let's start with someone who said, do you have any information on Putin's health? Because there have been a series of reports out citing U.S. intelligence sources saying that Putin is dying of cancer, that he's constantly attended by doctors, he looks sick, he's shaking, he's disappearing for periods of time. And then this fits into the narrative that the whole launching of these operations in Ukraine was based on Putin having a breakdown, Putin being megalomaniac, Putin losing control, and so on. Well, I can't say for certain that Putin is not having health problems. What I can say is that the stories are all the same. There's one story which says, quotes a U.S. Air Force official who says he has a Russian source, unverified. There's another one of a Russian defector who said he has a source within the Kremlin. We constantly see these anonymous sources. Remember the sources that said the Russians were paying the Taliban bounties for killing American soldiers in Afghanistan? The New York Times, the Washington Post ran with it, and then turns out eventually it was completely debunked. Another narrative to defend a policy of war. Now, whether or not Putin's sick, we'll find out at some point in the future. But obviously, this is being designed for the broader goal of the Western countries, which is regime change in Russia. The promotion of an idea that the Russian government would find more friendly response from the West if Putin were gone. And if Putin were dying of cancer, or being threatened with assassination from within, maybe this would hasten the emergence of anti-Putin forces inside Russia. I think this is wishful dreaming. Whether there's truth to it or not, I can't confirm, but I'm highly doubtful given the nature of these kinds of intelligence reports. And by the way, why not start questioning Biden's health? How about the mental health of Kamala Harris or Pelosi? You know, it's not exactly a bunch of spring chickens governing the West or misgoverning the West. So again, these stories have a purpose that goes beyond the attempt to provide the truth to the Western populations. Now, a second question from several people is there going to be a reaction in Europe to the effects of the sanctions, the economic effects, to the inflation, and so on? I mean, first of all, there was a report in the United States from Reuters, a poll that said that more than 80% of the American people think the U.S. is going in the wrong direction, and that over 70% think that the economy should be the most important issue for the country. Now, is there going to be social unrest in the United States? Well, there should be, because the policies of the Biden administration, where he admitted he intends to not question the independence of the Federal Reserve, when the Fed has played a major role with its money pumping operations and creating the inflation, well, there probably should be a reaction. The food shortages have not hit as hard yet in the U.S. as they're hitting in other countries, but this will happen. But in Europe, here's just one hint of this. The economics minister of Germany, Robert Habeck, who is probably the craziest official running an economic post in governments in the West. He's a hardcore green who's committed to shutting down efficient energy production, a total transition to so-called sustainable energy, even though he admits it's going to cause problems. Now, in a talk the other day, he admitted that he expects there might be social upheaval in the autumn and winter in Germany as heating costs go up. Well, what's his solution? Increase the costs to Russia so that the Russians will move to end the war. That's typical of the Greens. Baerbock, the foreign minister, who knows nothing about military concerns or gets all her talking points on foreign relations from the Atlantic Council and from NATO, she continues to say, punish Russia. That's the only way to stop this. Why not stop the weapons flows? Why not stop praising Zelensky as the greatest war hero in history, and instead tell him, cut the crap, go negotiate a deal, including neutrality for Ukraine? So I think there will be social eruptions. There already have been in France and Italy. German farmers have had tractorcades. There are truckers' strikes. I think the situation is going to get out of control because it's going to get worse. Now that brings up another question. Are there signs of disagreement within the establishment? And in particular, the person asked, what about the Bilderberg group? What about the World Economic Forum? Are there indications that they're starting to get nervous? Well, the indication that they're getting nervous was the fact that they refused to allow any negotiations with Russia before February, which ensured that there would be an operation coming from Moscow. They wanted the war. They intended to have the war. They're not going to back down on the war. And now I'm talking about the corporate cartels, the financial elite, and so on, who are committed to this destabilization, because what's their deeper fear? Social unrest, an unwillingness to accept the idea of giving up sovereignty, giving up control over the economy to international institutions, which have no interest in protecting the health and well-being of the populations of any country in the world. Now, where's the disagreement? Well, we see it over the back and forth over should there be tightening of interest rates or not. Now, interest rates are one aspect of the problem. Namely, if you have 0% interest to speculators, they're going to keep speculating. If you bail out speculators, they're going to keep speculating because there's no moral hazard for them if they lose. They get bailed out. Now, there are some who want inflation to continue because they say if you continue the inflation and have easy access to cash, to money for the speculators, they'll be able to pay off their debts with cheap money, while the effect on the general population will be that you'll lose your entire life savings and everything you've ever set aside. So this is where you see one of the pushes for the Great Reset. But there's some backtracking from that. There are some who say, well, we can't allow the inflation to continue. But what would happen if you try and cut off the inflation by raising interest rates 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% or more? Remember, Volcker in the early 1980s raised the rates to almost 20%. Well, the effect then would be chain reaction collapses of debt-ridden corporations, of banks, of financial institutions. Now, some people believe that this is the ultimate goal of the Davos group, because then they can come back in with a top-down control with a new system, maybe central bank, digital currencies or something of that sort. I think there's a bit of indecision from these establishment elites because they're seeing so much rebellion and resistance from populations, not even so much in the West, but in the South, in important countries like India, like Indonesia, like Brazil, that are unhappy with the situation. What happens then if you have demonstrations in the streets of Berlin, in the streets of Paris, in Washington, D.C., in Denver, Colorado, in Chicago? Well, I think we're coming into a point where it's absolutely essential that there be a movement with solutions, because the solution is not interest rates per se, it's credit policy. Who controls credit? Where does it go? That's a fundamental issue for the American people. That's something that Lyndon LaRouche raised 50 years ago, that if you don't direct credit into the physical economy, you have no solutions except boom and bust cycles. It will keep getting worse and will lead to the imposition of fascist or Shaktian economic policy. We cannot allow that to happen. There is a section in the establishment committed to Shaktian economic policy, the same ones committed to the war, because that's how they'll bail out their system while crushing the opposition. We must get ahead of that. That's why I again urge you to register below for our upcoming conference on how to put the world through a bankruptcy reorganization to establish a new financial architecture. Nothing else will work. Pointing fingers at the Bilderbergs or the World Economic Forum, that's not a solution. A solution is bankrupting them and organizing the population to support that bankruptcy reorganization. So register for our conference, and I will see you again next week. Share this video. Get your friends thinking. Challenge them. Let's see if we can get this mobilization moving to an even higher level. Goodbye.